one provision that shows up in the boilerplate of many agreements is what's sometimes referred to as a merger clause, which can be confusing if you're actually working on a merger agreement, but it has nothing to do with the corporate merger that you're working on. It actually merges all the prior agreements, or really supersedes all the prior agreements that the parties might have entered into. And there's a lot of reasons for this, technical reasons for lawyers to have that kind of a provision, because there's a bunch of old cases where there was uncertainty about what happens if you have a later writing and whether you're really replacing the prior writing, et cetera. And so lawyers are very particular, and they'll say, hey, this agreement, this supersedes and replaces all other prior written agreements that the parties to this contract have had with one another on this subject matter, so that there's no confusion about what governs. And why is that relevant? Well, remember, we had like maybe a letter of intent that, although called non-binding, had some binding provisions. That was a contract between the parties, and the definitive agreement may not exactly reflect what was in the letter of intent. The parties might have drifted one way or another or embellished a particular area. And you don't want there to be any confusion or argument later about, well, hey, the letter of intent is still out there. It's still a valid agreement between the parties, and that still governs the relationship. So you put this clause in there. But I'll say, and it sounds completely appropriate, in most cases it is. In some cases it's not, though. And so in thinking about this, you have to consider what other agreements exist between the parties and whether you actually want to replace them. I'll give you an example, and that would be a non-disclosure agreement that might have been entered into between the parties. It stands on its own. And it protects, the confidentiality of information. And when we get to this place where we're going to sign the definitive agreement and actually get the transaction completed, if there's not a new non-disclosure provision in the M&A contract, and there might be, but if there's not one, then you may want to carve out that non-disclosure agreement from this merger clause and make sure that it continues to have vitality after the transaction closes.